Good morning.
Good
Hey, Ted.
morning.
Can you hear me, Ted? Yeah, sounds like you can. How you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you, sir?
I am also doing well. I'm assuming you're not at work.
Not at work today.
Yeah, kind of crazy. How are things up there, up where you are? Are you like because of the coronavirus, like nothing going on? You just kind of have to not much work. Or how's that? What are you guys doing up there with that stuff?
So they split us up into kind of three different day types. The one day we're doing just respiratory clinic and just seeing coronavirus. Then another day we're doing video only visits where we're just doing video visits. And then a third day we're seeing anybody else who's not sick with corona, but who has to have something done physically in person, like some sort of something cut on or something surgical or something where we have to examine it. So it's kind of weird. We just went into this new mode where half the visits are virtual and a whole bunch of them are respiratory coronavirus, maybe, and so it's just kind of weird.
Yeah, it's kind of, I guess, I mean, it's kind of interesting because I know they've laid off and furloughed a lot of different healthcare providers throughout the country. So it's kind of been interesting how it's kind of different by
Mm-hmm.
region. Are you seeing a pretty high prevalence where you're at, or what's it
Uh,
like out there?
we were seeing a ton of coronavirus like 3 weeks ago, but it's really died down. We're on the other side of the curve. I mean, we peaked, in late March, and it's just been downhill ever since. And now we're not seeing nearly as much. And at no time did we never filled up the hospital. We never filled up the ICU. We never ran out of beds. We never ran out of ventilators. All of Seattle, none of the hospitals filled. We kind of sneaked through. I guess our social distancing thing is working or whatever, and we seem to be making it through, and if you know what
Yeah, and because Washington was one of the early spots that had relatively a lot of cases early on, I guess. So interesting there. So Ted, let me for you guys who don't know Ted is, and I've talked to Ted many times before. Ted is a wonderful resource. He is an advocate of protein, as am I for the most part, as you guys know. Ted has been doing primary care medical practice for 20 some years, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right, Ted? Yeah.
I mean. Yeah, that's correct.
And you were trained in Loma Linda in the heart of vegetarian land and found
Correct.
and now are a black sheep perhaps from there. So
Mm-hmm.
I want to you wrote a book, a very good book by the way, called the PE diet, protein energy ratio diet, and you know, I know it's available on digital copy. Did you ever get it? Were you able to get it done on hard copy ever, or does that?
Not yet. We finally found somebody to maybe print it for us. It might be available in a month or two, but it's just
Okay.
so expensive because the book is huge. It has like 500 color photos and it's 300 something pages, and it's going to cost a ton of money. So we're just depressed about how expensive. It's basically like a photo coffee table book. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it looks like Phil is holding up. What did you print out all the slides, Phil? Is that what you did? Wow, look at that. Well, there you go. Maybe you
I'm
can.
sorry. I mean, I hope you did that at work because like the toner price of that is going to be $50 for sure. It's just brutal. It's depressing.
So let me just, like I said, obviously this is a carnivorous community, so we are all probably mostly protein friendly. There's some people that skew more towards a fat-based approach. Like I said, I think it depends on where we're at. Let's talk a little bit just about protein energy ratio, just so people understand the concept. And I've got some specific questions. I'm sure some of the guests in this thing will have questions I'll relate to you. So what is the protein energy philosophy, I guess?
Okay, so basically, we're breaking down food in general into really two things, and that's what plants are at the base of all nutrition. I should start out with that. Plants take solar energy from the sun and store it as chemical energy. That's where every animal on Earth gets its energy from. Plants suck up nitrogen and other minerals from the soil and incorporate that into proteins, and that's where every animal on Earth gets its protein from. So every single animal is only alive because it's constantly eating other living things, either plants or animals, but all the food is coming from plants, either energy from the sun, stored as chemical energy, or nitrogen and other minerals from the soil. And so I'm breaking down food into protein, which is basically nitrogen and minerals from soil, versus energy, which is anything stored as a high energy carbon-carbon bond. That could be carbohydrates or fat. And the reason I'm looking at this is because humans have this incredibly powerful protein satiety drive, and you're going to eat and eat and eat and eat until you get enough protein, and only then are you going to stop eating. And what we've done to the human food supply is dilute the crap out of our protein with energy, mostly from plants, carbs and fats. We have all these refined carbs and fats that we dumped into the food supply. So now you have to massively overeat carb and fat energy to get enough protein to not be hungry. The whole goal of this PE diet is to go out of your way to target protein first and center all your meals around protein. So you're getting this protein satiety at a lower energy intake, and then you're just basically thinner. It's kind of the antidote to the obesity epidemic.
Ted, I've looked a lot into satiety and appetite, as I continue to read and stuff like that. I mean, when you say protein satiety, where is that coming through? Is that coming through, peptide YY, cholecystokinin? Where is that satiety? What is actually going on when we eat protein? Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, well, nobody really knows for sure. This completely remains to be elucidated. Like, we really don't know. We just know it's a thing. I'm basing a lot of my book on the research by Doctors Raubenheimer and Simpson, who really just looked at all sorts of different species, from humans to primates to, I mean, everything, insects, fish, like all of your animals are going to prioritize protein and eat until they get a certain protein amount. And the amount of energy that humans in particular eat could go up and down by an order of magnitude in order for them to get enough protein. And so there's this huge leverage to protein for most animals, and it's just a big driving force. But we have zero clue. We have no clue how that works. We don't know if your body is sensing, just the nitrogen content. We don't know if it's specific amino acids. We don't know if that's in the brain. We really don't know. Nobody knows exactly how it works. We just know it's a thing. So we're still in the infancy of all of this. The whole protein leverage hypothesis was really only discovered about a decade ago, and we just don't know what's powering it.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen, that amino acids can affect, I know peptide YY and GLP-1, the incretin hormone is kind of more distal in the GI tract, but whether that's the main driver or not, it's interesting. Um, Let me ask you, do you feel, what about overeating protein? Is it doable? Can we do that on a normal diet? I mean, what are your thoughts on, can I eat too much protein?
I So for most people, as long as you don't have some sort of weird problem with nitrogen elimination, or as long as you don't have some rare genetic disease that causes issues, you almost can't eat too much protein. I mean, you could eat so much protein and so little energy that you just felt like crap. I think that would be easy to do. But in terms of medically, like, could there be a person who walked into my office and I looked at them and said, oh, you're eating too much protein? I mean, that's really not even a thing. And I've seen studies in the medical literature where, athletes were eating 80% of their calories from protein. These were all short term, but nothing bad happened to them. They could still function. They didn't talk about how good they felt subjectively. I'm guessing they felt like crap. But there doesn't seem to be this medical danger to too much protein. I mean, we've kind of placed the cap for protein as 35% of calories in humans, but that was very arbitrary, and there's really nothing bad that happens to people higher than that. Plenty of bodybuilders who've maintained up to about 50% of their calories from protein long term. Now, I'm not even suggesting that anyone ever do that. I'm just saying, hey, let's drag it up from the 12.5% protein that is the standard American diet, which is definitely not working out.
Yeah, I mean, we see that for sure. I mean, and just right now, currently, I bet I'm getting 70% of my calories from protein right now as I'm kind of leaning out. I don't know, kind of switch gears a little bit, trying to get a little leaner for some crazy, stupid CrossFit stuff. But so I've been high protein. I do a fat refeed day about every 5 days. I find that I can go lean for about 4 or 5 days, and then I incorporate it. As uh, fats are essential. I mean, you don't have to essentially eat nothing but fat. I mean, I think there's an amount you need. Carbohydrates are optional. We don't have to have them. I know you include about 100 grams in your diet or something like that, or at least I've heard you say that in the past. Um, what do you? So I want to ask about diabetics because I think according to my reading, and looking at because we do see diabetics that go higher protein and they do see a little bump in their blood glucose sometimes. Is there a different way diabetics handle protein with regard to gluconeogenesis, glycogenolysis, so on and so forth that we might see something like that around protein?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, of course, type 1 diabetics have a huge spike in blood sugar from protein. And the way it works is protein raises insulin and glucagon at the same time. And if you're a type 1 diabetic, you're making the glucagon, which raises your blood sugar, but not the insulin. In that scenario, what you're really doing is releasing hepatic glycogen and raising your blood sugar that way. But you're definitely going to see spikes in blood sugar from protein as a type 1 diabetic, which you do have to dose insulin for. In a type 2 diabetic, you get this sort of unpredictable insulin resistance at different tissues. So you might see your blood sugar go up with protein because of the glucagon release, and the insulin effect you might be resistant to. So you might be functionally seeing some rise in your blood sugar from protein. It's really not the protein directly turning into glucose necessarily. It's a glucagon related glucose release from the liver. But anyone who's not diabetic shouldn't see their blood sugar budge at all, no matter how much protein they eat.
Yeah, and I know you talk about, and again, I think there's a difference between glycogen replete and glycogen depleted states. And you talk about depleting glycogen, and this is in the context of getting lean or weight loss. Can you talk a little bit about how we achieve that and what's the rationale for doing that and how does that affect these sort of things?
Right, right. So you have very limited glycogen storage in your body. I mean, the average person can only shove 100 grams of glucose into the liver as glycogen and maybe 300 grams of glucose into the muscles as glycogen. And your liver glycogen, it does gradually fall after you've eaten carbohydrate. And so you can deplete liver glycogen after about 16 to 24 hours of not eating carbs. But that muscle glycogen is not going away unless you're doing high intensity exercise. So if you're mostly sedentary and you're just walking around, you're never depleting your muscle glycogen. And then the only room in your body to store these carbs is really in your liver, and that's maybe 100 grams tops. And so we have all these sedentary Americans who do literally 0 minutes of high intensity exercise per day, which is the average for Americans. And then they only have room for maybe 100 grams of carbs in their liver per day. Um, and yet we're eating 300 grams of carbs a day, which is completely screwed up and just really makes everybody super glucose dependent. And they're constantly converting excess glucose into fat. So they're doing this lipogenesis in the liver, which gives you fatty liver. So I think it's just massively health promoting to deplete glycogen with high intensity exercise. So if you're turning over glycogen, if you're depleting it with high intensity exercise and then forcing your body to replenish that, it's like a workout for your metabolism. I think it's really health promoting. And that's why I like everybody to do some sort of high intensity exercise, even if it's really brief. It's just really good to deplete some of that muscle glycogen. And then, of course, the more muscle you have, the better off you are.
Yeah, and when you say high intensity exercise, there's kind of two, because there's high intensity training, which is kind of muscle building, as espoused by Doug McGuff and some of those other guys, and then there's high intensity interval training, which is a little bit different. Can you talk to the relative efficacy of either or both of those with regard to what you're talking about?
Right, right. So high intensity training is basically lifting weights to failure, and high intensity interval training is doing some sort of cardio at also to failure, basically at the highest intensity you can handle. And honestly, either one burns glycogen. You're probably going to burn more glycogen with high intensity interval training just because it's a longer duration. Your high intensity training lifts are maybe 60 seconds each. And so just the amount of glycogen you burn is going to be more with some sort of whole body cardio. You know, if you're doing burpees or something that involves your whole body and you end up doing 8 or 10 minutes of intervals, you're going to burn more glycogen than just lifting, just because of the volume is higher, the duration's higher. But honestly, I'll take either one. Either one is going to deplete glycogen in your muscles. And so you could just say high intensity anything, and I'm going to like it because it's going to burn glycogen.
Hey, what are your thoughts? We could talk about glycogen. Let's shift about, because you mentioned hepatic lipogenesis. There's some of this concept of de novo lipogenesis, and the liver can basically turn any energy into fat. And it can take carbon molecules from fat molecules or carbohydrate molecules and turn that into fat. How do we fix that issue, or is it a problem? I know there's athletes, particularly low carb athletes, that will have triglycerides in their myocytes. That's considered a paradox, but for many people, particularly people that are unhealthy metabolically, we see accumulation of ectopic fat in different areas. So what's the strategy on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the way to not be performing lipogenesis is to honestly keep your carbohydrate intake underneath the amount you're depleting. So that would be less than 100 grams per day if you're not doing any high intensity exercise. And then if you're doing high intensity exercise, you could probably get away with another 50 grams of carbs per hour of exercise or so, maybe 50 to 100. But I really think the way to avoid lipogenesis, de novo lipogenesis, is to stay below your carbohydrate utilization, which for honestly your average person is going to be under 100 grams a day.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some evidence. We had Ben Bickman on there talking about fructose being particularly potent at de novo lipogenesis, particularly in the amounts of fructose the Americans' diet seems to contain, the sugary garbage that's in everything.
Yeah, I think soda is where you really start seeing just the disaster zone of fructose, just because, your can of soda is like 70 grams of sugar and half of that is fructose. And you down a couple of those a day, and now you're into some serious de novo lipogenesis. And that's, I think, sugar sweetened beverages is like just a fatty liver nightmare. And we're just seeing it everywhere now.
Yeah, so Phil was just asking about, if you're taking in carbs, what are you personally using? What is your rationale for them? Are there some that are better than others? I guess would be the answer to the question there.
Right, right. So I'm eating about 100 grams of carbs a day. And for me, it's twofold. Number one is the satiety hack, because if I eat absolutely no carbs, and I've certainly tried that, I get really hungry and I end up having to eat just a ton of fat or protein to kind of satisfy this just little bit of hunger that I could actually satisfy with like maybe an apple or something. So I end up strategically using, up to 100 grams of carbs a day, usually in the evening when I've already eaten enough, protein and nutrients. And then I'll eat a little bit of targeted carbohydrate. I'm way less hungry. I can get by with fewer calories. I basically just walk around a little bit leaner and I sleep better. Now, not everybody is like that. There are plenty of people who don't have to do that. And I think most of your carnivores are in that boat, but everybody's a little bit different, I think, in that regard. And I definitely haven't figured out, how to know how people are going to react to any of this stuff. I think we're still in the Wild West on the carnivore thing, on the zero carb thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think we're still learning. I think one of the things, and I'm sure you've seen this, hormone ghrelin, which kind of stimulates appetite, seems to peak later in the day and it's pretty low in the morning. That's why a lot of people, when they wake up, they're not particularly hungry. What about using those carbohydrates, in the workout period, maybe as an option? Do you do that sometimes?
I usually don't. I like to work out fasted, and I'm not really doing it for any health promotion. It's just like a personal preference. I just feel better. So I mostly work out fasted. I don't do any carbs before my workout, during my workout, after my workout. But for some people, a little bit of carbohydrate is an ergogenic aid, and they actually just get a better workout. And so I'm certainly cool with anyone who has experienced that. And some people do eat a little bit of carbohydrate either right before or right during. And I think that's fine. And, you just have to kind of decide what works best for you. I personally don't do that, but I think, again, everybody's different.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. What are your thoughts on animal fat versus plant protein as far as, are they equal or different? Is one better than the other?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, plant protein is vastly inferior, and it's less digestible, it's less bioavailable, it's not a complete amino acid. If you look at your vegan bodybuilders, like every vegan bodybuilder on earth will tell you that if you're using whey protein and you need one scoop, if you're using, rice protein, pea protein, hemp protein, you need two scoops of that, and it might not be complete. Soybeans is probably as close as you're going to get to complete plant protein. Um, and even that is vastly inferior, and you just need a higher quantity of it to get the same amino acids, and it's just not as good. So, plant protein, you can get by with it. It's possible, it's not optimal. I'll be the first to say that you can accomplish anything you want to do without animal protein, but it's really complicated. It's a real uphill battle. You have to combine different plant foods. You're always going to be low on something. There are a lot of essential amino acids that just are really low in plant foods. Leucine, which is kind of important for building muscle, leucine, lysine, methionine. These are all really low. Tryptophan, very low in plant protein sources. And so you've got a bunch of amino acids that are good for building plants, but you're really low on the ones that you need to build animals. And so it's just inefficient, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, honestly, animal protein is a lot closer to what you need to turn food into as an animal. So it's just a lot more optimized to eat animals.
There is, let's see, someone asking about combining fat and protein and sorry, fat and carbohydrate together. If you're doing this 100 grams of carbs, are you on those times, are you particularly limiting fat, or what is your fat intake typically then?
Yes, I'm specifically avoiding fat when I eat these carbohydrates. And again, that's just a satiety hack, because if I combine the two, I'm definitely going to eat more. So if when I eat this 100 grams of carbs, it's usually in a low fat setting. So I might eat plain potatoes. I might eat fruit. Fruit and tubers are the most common, and I'm typically intentionally not eating any fat with that. I might have a meal with protein in it, but even then it'll be a leaner protein. So, I'm usually eating 2 meals a day. The first meal is high in protein and then higher in fat. It's steak and eggs. The second meal, it's high in protein, but it might be higher in carb. I might eat chicken breast and a potato or something like that. And so, yes, I'm definitely trying to separate carbs and fats. And the only reason I'm doing that is because when you combine high energy density carbs and fats together, you're going to overeat it. And that's just half of the obesity epidemic on the planet. It's high energy density carbs and fats together, your donuts, your pizza, your French fries, your potato chips, your cakes, your cookies, your muffins, your everything you can think of that's addictive and people overeat.
What's the rationale behind the decision to do, high fat in the morning and higher carb in the evening? Is it just a sleep thing, or is it better satiety, or is it just kind of there's some more science behind that?
Well, there's a couple things. First of all, when I wake up in the morning, I'm super fat adapted. At this point, I'm generating a lot of ketones, and I'm not that hungry, and I'm running pretty nicely on fat. And it's very easy for me to just go on to eat a meal that doesn't have any carbs and it's just protein and fat. The other thing that I like about not eating carbs early in the day is because the second you eat carbohydrate, you might be setting yourself up for this sort of roller coaster, where 3 or 4 hours later, you're hungrier because you feel your blood sugar dropping. So I don't want to be on the blood sugar roller coaster that everybody's on. So the very, 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 very worst breakfast, in my opinion, would be a whole bunch of carbs with no protein and no fat. That would be, what everybody eats for breakfast in this country, which is just your cereal and your skim milk and your toast and your juice and all of this bullshit. So I think that's absolute worst case scenario, your high carb, low protein, low fat breakfast. And so I'm trying to emulate the exact opposite of that, which is basically a high protein, high fat breakfast. And I stay in this ketosis, fat burning state longer. And then, like I said, any carbohydrate I'm going to eat is later on, usually in the evening. And it's usually in a lower fat setting. And again, I am eating protein at that meal usually. And so I almost eat these carbohydrates as a dessert. I also intentionally eat protein and any fiber or veggies first, and then the carbohydrate is last. It's sort of like a dessert because you get a much better incretin profile, and you don't get the crazy blood sugar ups and downs, and it just seems to work a little bit better for me.
Somebody's asking if you can talk about the Randle cycle in layman's terms. I imagine you're familiar with that because I treat
Gotcha. Okay, so your body can either burn fat or glucose. And the second glucose is present coming in from the outside, you just isocalorically shut down fat oxidation to the quantity based on the amount you're eating. But there's this giant seesaw in literally all of your cells where when carbs are absent, you're automatically burning fat because that's all you've got. And when carbs are coming in and present, you have to slow down fat oxidation by the same amount. And the reason this happens is because you have such limited storage for carbs, you basically have to burn them all as they're coming in, unless you've got this glycogen storage room, which is very small in most people. So it's like this giant seesaw in your body, fat, glucose, and it's glucose that completely controls it. If glucose is present, you're not going to burn fat. If glucose is absent, you have to burn entirely fat. So that's basically the Randle cycle, is this giant fat glucose seesaw in your body where the presence or absence of glucose completely determines how much fat you're burning.
Hey, Ted, let me ask you about, because we talk about protein and so talk about protein requirements or suggested amounts, I guess maybe grams per kilo, grams per pound for different populations. Is there, old people, young people, men, women, athletes, non-athletes, sedentary people, and then diabetics, non-diabetics? Do we have different, are those people handled differentially?
Well, okay, so my advice to everyone is a gram per pound of desired or ideal body weight. The US RDA is set, at about a third of that, but that's a bare minimum that you have to get, or you're going to be just frankly deficient and have a disease state. So ironically, the thinner and healthier and more muscular you are and the more active you are, and the younger you are, the less protein you actually need. So if you got some young, healthy, active bodybuilder who has lots of testosterone and is eating a bunch of carbs and fats that are protein sparing, they could probably get by with, 90 grams of protein a day and still build muscle and be really healthy. But it's when you have older people and sicker people and overweight people and pre-diabetics and diabetics, they actually have a higher protein requirement because they're either burning protein they're making glucose out of protein at night when they're sleeping because they're not fat adapted. They're older people have anabolic resistance, so they require more protein to build the same amount of muscle. If you look at protein burning, anyone on the insulin resistant spectrum is going to be basically chewing up more of the protein that they eat. So we're in this sad situation where the older or sicker or fatter you are, the more protein you need, but the less these people tend to eat protein. So they need more protein, they're eating less protein, and then they have to massively overeat more carbs and fats to get protein. And then they're just steadily getting fatter. And that's why all these people are just gaining a pound a year and they end up 50 pounds overweight. And you can combat that by just targeting the hell out of protein. But again, I actually think the people who need protein the most are the ones who most people would guess don't need it. Like your inactive, older, pre-diabetic person who's not working out. You would assume, oh, well, they don't need very much protein, but they actually need more protein than somebody who's really healthy and active. So my advice to pretty much everybody on the planet is a gram per pound of ideal body weight. You just look up your ideal body weight for your height, or basically what you know you should weigh if you're lean, and you eat a gram per pound, and that seems to work for just about everybody.
What was I going to ask, Ted? When it comes to diabetics, does eating more protein? No, this is what I want to ask. So there's some literature out there that says that branched chain amino acidemia, and these are some of the things we talked about earlier. Animal products being richer in that seem to be related with intramyocellular lipid deposition. Have you seen any of that research, and can you comment on that?
No, I mean, so there's really two reasons why people are going to have intramyocellular lipids. The first reason is you're just over fat, right? Anyone who's gaining fat, getting fatter, they're going to fill up their subcutaneous fat. The fat's going to spill over into visceral fat. They're going to fill up their visceral adipocytes. Then you start getting ectopic fat, where your body just shoves fat anywhere it can. Your muscles get all marbled like a grain-fed steak. You get more fat in your heart, in your liver, in your pancreas, in your arteries, in your muscles. Now you've got all this fat everywhere. Part of it is you ate so much carbohydrate that displaced fat oxidation because of the Randle cycle, that you're just constantly eating fat that never gets burned, and so you have to store it, and that's why everyone's getting fatter. You're not expending enough energy, so you're just, the fat just sits around and accumulates. And then you got too much fat in your cells, you got too much fat in your muscle. That's the insulin resistance intramyocellular triglycerides. But then you also see, like you mentioned, the paradox. You see like marathon runners and endurance athletes and Ironman triathletes who have a bunch of intramuscular triglyceride, but it's different. So these little intramuscular triglycerides are really, really close to the mitochondria. And your muscle's done this on purpose because it's like, holy crap, we need energy to run, 20 miles. And so we're going to store this little fat droplet right next to the mitochondria, and we're going to be super, super good at utilizing fat. And we're just going to have a really high maximum fat oxidation with exercise, and we're going to use these triglycerides and deplete them regularly, and then we're going to replenish them and keep them around because we know we got to run another 20 miles tomorrow. So the two things that drive intramuscular triglyceride is either being over fat and having no place to put fat, or you're just strategically keeping a little fat droplet next to all your mitochondria in your muscle because you use it so often. I don't know anything about branch chain amino acids contributing to this intramuscular triglyceride accumulation, and I don't think it's a big driver either way. I don't think it has much to do with it. I think those are the two scenarios where you're going to really see the intramuscular fat.
Yeah, what I've read is there's a product called acylcarnitines that apparently are associated with the branched chain amino acidemia. But interestingly enough, and I talked to Ben Bickman about this, he thinks that it is a effect in what we're seeing is muscle catabolism, and this is where the branched chain amino acids are coming from that contribute to this sort of phenomenon. And so these acylcarnitines, apparently, there's this concept of mitochondrial overload where, you get these incomplete oxidation products and you get ceramides and diacylglycerides accumulating. And because what we see is some people, like maybe these plant-based advocates will say, see, you shouldn't be eating branched chain amino acids to the extent that you do, i.e. don't eat animal products. And they say the same thing with regard to saturated fats, because we see that palmitate or palmitic acid, which is saturated fat, can cause similar issues. And then again, it's coming from de novo lipogenesis, not dietary saturated fat. And what are your thoughts on saturated fat, Ted? I mean, is there what's poly, mono, saturated, what's best, what's worse? Are we misinformed about some of these things?
Well, okay, so my thought on saturated fat is probably a little bit controversial. I think that if you're lean and healthy and active, you can eat all the saturated fat you want, and it's totally harmless and it's not a problem whatsoever. But I think that if you're over fat and you have too much fat in your body, I mean, anytime you've eaten too much and you're over fat, you're basically storing saturated fat. It's all palmitate, it's all saturated fat. So your average person who's over fat, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, pre-diabetic, diabetic, they all have way too much saturated fat in their body. I think in that setting, eating more saturated fat is actually bad for you. The requirement for saturated fat in the human diet is literally 0. You do not have to eat saturated fat because we make so much of it so well. It's so easy to make. All your extra calories can be turned into saturated fat. So you don't really have to eat any. Now, I think it's a great thing to eat if you're thin and you're lean and you're active. I say go for it. I say it's a really clean burning fuel. It's what your body's designed to run on. It's what we store all of our energy as. That's mostly what you should be burning, in my opinion. So if you're healthy, most of your energy should come from saturated fat. I hope it's coming from saturated fat. But if you have way too much saturated fat in your body, eating more saturated fat is probably bad, especially for diabetics who have no place to store any more saturated fat. If a diabetic eats a ton of saturated fat, their blood sugar the next day goes way up. It almost goes up as high as their blood sugar does when they eat carbohydrate. And that kind of brings me to the flip side of saturated fat, which is dietary glucose. Dietary glucose is kind of analogous. It's something that you absolutely do not have to eat. There's 0 requirement for it in the human diet because we can make our own. So for, all the low carbers, we're like, all this dietary glucose is displacing fat oxidation. You don't need it. We don't have room to store it. We're not burning all this glycogen. You should eat way, way less of it. And we're totally right about that. But then you've got all the vegans who are like, okay, if you're over fat, should you really eat more saturated fat when you have too much in your body? I think they're probably correct there. I think you probably do want to eat less saturated fat if you're massively over fat and there's too much saturated fat in your body. And I think that's why eating saturated fat might look bad epidemiologically, because 91% of humans on Earth are over fat, and eating more saturated fat might actually be bad for them. So for me, I'm always trying to see both sides. I'm trying to see where the low fat vegans are coming from. I'm trying to see where the low carb, carnivores are coming from. And to be honest, there's a point there where they're both correct. And if you're over fat, you don't want to eat extra carbs for glucose, which you don't need, which you can manufacture yourself. And you don't want to eat extra saturated fat because you got too much in your body and you can make any that you need. So that's my thought on saturated fat. Mentally, for me, it's almost like the flip side of glucose, and they're eating too much of either one is bad if you're over fat. Now, I also will say that for a lean person who's, metabolically sensitive, super active, depleting glycogen, I think in that setting, you can get away with eating glucose or saturated fat as well. So they're kind of two sides to the same coin for me.
What about, so I mean, but it sounds like an energy thing. What about monounsaturated fat then in that situation, Ted? I mean, is it just we all have to eat lean? Everybody who's overweight needs to just eat a bunch of lean chicken breast or plant protein, or how do we, how do you? I mean, because it sounds like it's just energy overload, which I certainly understand and largely agree with. Where do we, how do we deal with that? Let's say we are obese and we
Mhm.
are over fat or over glycogenated. What do we got to do?
Right. Okay. So I think if you're obese, pre-diabetic, diabetic, over fat, energy toxic, whatever you want to call it, I think there's two things that you really do want to eat less of. That's basically dietary glucose, carbohydrates, net carbs, and that's also added fat. So anything that, I think you want to avoid uh, refined fats, oil, butter, heavy cream. I don't think you want to go out of your way to eat this, just the same way you don't want to go out of your way to eat refined carbs like sugar and flour. And so my advice to anyone who's trying to lose weight, who's over fat, is to target protein and minerals and then try to keep the added fats as low as possible and try to keep the net carbs as low as possible at the same time. And now you have to eat some fat for satiety, right? Like I don't want anyone going under, 30% of their calories from fat because you're just not going to get any satiety. Also, all of your protein has fat incorporated into it for a reason. And I think we see humans eat the very, very least amount of energy when they're eating, a combination of protein and fat. So I think that you have to eat fat, but it's essential, but you don't have to eat added fat. You don't have to eat refined fat. And that's where I want people to focus when they're over fat. You want to avoid refined fats. You want to eat added fat. You want to avoid added and refined carbs too.
Yeah. And what is, so what does that look like? Ted? Can you like, what foods are safety? Can I eat ribeye steaks? Can I eat salmon? Salmon's a relatively fatty fish. Should I be eating shrimp and chicken breast? I mean, I don't know. What are your
I
thoughts on
think
that?
you should eat any animal that itself is eating what it's supposed to eat. You know what I mean? Like if we just dumped you off at a random latitude on Earth at a random time of year with nothing but a spear and a loincloth, you go out and kill an animal and eat the whole thing. I think that's perfect macros. So anytime you're killing an animal and eating it, and that animal's eating what it's supposed to eat, then I think you're golden. And that could be any ruminant, beef, lamb. That could be any kind of fish or seafood or shellfish. That could be poultry. That could be whatever you want. You kill an animal, you eat it, you're golden. I think where we get into trouble is where we eat the very fattest part of the very fattest animal that's been artificially fattened. Like if your diet is 100% bacon, you've got the fattest part of the fattest animal that's artificially fattened by humans with a bunch of garbage usually, and that's probably suboptimal. Like bacon's going to have 3 grams of fat to 2 grams of protein. I think you'd be better off just eating a cow or something, and you tend to have more closer to 2 grams of protein to 1 gram of fat when you eat animals in their entirety that were eating what they were supposed to eat. So basically protein grams are higher than fat grams. And I think anytime you're doing that, you're winning. I think that's totally safe. And that's my advice to most people: center your diet around animals that were eating reasonably what they were supposed to eat.
Yeah, somebody's asking about how can protein turn into saturated fat? Is there a mechanism by which we can do that if we overeat protein?
It's so hard to do that it's almost impossible. So it's energetically so costly to turn protein into fat that the extent to which it happens in the body is minuscule, but you can actually do it. And so theoretically, if you force fed yourself protein, you could turn some of that into fat. And
Yeah,
basically the
just
protein, oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead, Ted. I'll let you finish some
Oh,
of another topic. So
oh, well, you deaminate the protein and you're left with the carbon skeleton, and you break that down into either acetyl-CoA or uh, based on which amino acid is specifically, but then you can use that as a precursor to build fat, and it goes through the Krebs cycle just like anything else you oxidize. And so you could theoretically eat enough protein to make fat out of it, but it's really energetically costly and it hardly ever happens.
yeah, what are your thoughts? Because somebody's asking about the bulletproof coffee, the fat added coffee. Any benefit to that? And then I guess in the broader picture, talk about meal frequency. You eat 2 meals a day. What are your thoughts about fasting, whether intermittent fasting or extended fasting?
All right. Okay. So bulletproof coffee. Again, if you're thin, if you're lean, if you're metabolically sensitive, if you're insulin sensitive, if you're exercising, drink all the bulletproof coffee you want. I mean, I love coffee. I got my coffee right here. Your butter or whatever, that's fine. It's a perfectly reasonable place to get calories. If, however, you're trying to lose weight, if you're over fat, you really want to eat something with a higher nutrient density. I mean, butter has no protein, very few minerals, and so you're not going to really get the same satiety out of it. So I think bulletproof coffee is not a good idea for someone who's over fat. You have to fast for 6 hours to burn all the fat in your bulletproof coffee. And so that's really going to slow down fat loss for people who are overweight. So they'd be much better off eating a leaner protein, something with way more satiety. You asked me something else, but I think I forgot what it
Yeah, it was
was.
just
Oh,
about your thoughts on fasting schedules and different fasting
oh,
regimens.
right. I mean, I love intermittent fasting. I do a 16-8 every day. I think that's the sweet spot for your average person. I recommend that as sort of like a starting point for most people. I'm basically eating 2 meals a day, 8 hours apart.
And do you feel that like because you're obviously lean, Ted, and I'm generally pretty lean. That's mostly what I do. Some days it's 1, some days it's 3, but most times it's 2. What about someone who is obese, metabolic, diabetic? Is there any advantage to longer fasts? I know Jason Fung is a huge fan of that. What are your thoughts on that? Is it better just to eat a better diet, or is it better to not eat for 2 or 3 days?
I basically never recommend that anybody fast over 24 hours. And honestly, I'm concerned about lean mass losses. And so every client I see, my goal is to get them the very highest lean mass and at the very lowest fat mass. I mean, that's the goal of everyone aesthetically, but that's also the goal of everyone when it comes to health. You want the most muscle at the least fat if you're trying to be as insulin sensitive as possible. And I think that when you fast for more than 24 hours, you are going to lose some lean mass, especially if you're a diabetic who's just chewing up way more protein for glucose overnight than anybody else is. And I'm mostly worried about the catabolism these people are having, especially older people. Like if you're an older person who's on the diabetes spectrum, you're going to have some serious protein losses with extended fasting. And I don't really like that. I'd prefer these people to be on like a protein sparing modified fast where they're eating some protein, but just keeping the energy really low, the carbs and fats. I think that's better. So I usually don't tell people to fast over 24 hours.
Yeah, can you describe the protein sparing modified fast, as opposed to your normal diet?
Right, protein sparing modified fast is basically eating less carbs and fats, but not eating less protein or fiber. So protein sparing modified fast, you're choosing foods that are really high in protein and fiber, but are really low in carbs and fats. So you might eat ultra lean protein like lean beef, you might eat skinless poultry, you might eat fish, whey protein, egg whites, any kind of fiber, so green vegetables or whatever. But you're keeping the net carbs really low, so you're not eating all your grains and your starches, and you're keeping your sum total fat really low, so you're not eating, nuts and dairy and fatty meat. You're eating just basically lean protein and maybe fibrous veggies. It's basically, fish and salad, chicken breast and salad. This is a way to give yourself protein and minerals for a little bit of satiety and to keep from catabolizing lean mass, but keeping the energy so low that you're forced to run all of your energetic needs off of stored body fat. And it is very successful. This is basically at the end of show prep, this is basically what every single bodybuilder and bikini model and fitness model and aesthetic athlete on earth is doing. And it's phenomenally successful. And at that point, these people are eating, 3, 4, 5 times a day, because if they go more than a few hours without eating, they literally have to burn muscle to make some energy out of it, just because they just don't have enough fat on their body to harvest, enough fat from. So that, of course, that's a really extreme case, but that's kind of it just illustrates the fact that you will lose lean mass at some point if you're fasting.
Yeah. Are you in that situation? Are you in a significant caloric deficit as well, or is it just the energy deficit?
I mean, I think it's one and the same. I honestly, I don't like calories because of protein. I feel like protein doesn't really count, and it protein gets sort of unfairly treated when it comes to calories. I think fat does as well. That's why I'm not really talking about calories a whole lot, but you kind of, at that point, you're talking one and the same, calories or fatted carbs.
Yeah, I'm just, because I like on the days that I'm eating leaner, I'm probably still getting 300 grams of protein. I mean, it's, so I'm
Mhm.
not, I'm not starving. Oh, this is the other thing. Mark Bell wanted me to ask you this. Humans can only process 20 to 30 grams of protein at one time. What are your thoughts on that sentiment?
I mean, that's total garbage. Just absolute crap. Like, if that was true, humans would have died out a really long time ago. That can't be true. Especially if you look at any kind of wild animal carnivore. I mean, that just absolutely cannot be true, and I don't believe that at all. I have way too many people just eating one meal a day, and their body composition's awesome, and so it just cannot be true. That I don't even know where that came from.
Yeah, I think I know some of the protein studies showing what's optimal for muscle protein synthesis will suggest, 30 some grams, 40 grams at a time, multiple times throughout the day is more efficacious for muscle protein synthesis. But I think that's usually done based on whey proteins is typically how they do that. And I think we'll talk about if you eat a big bolus of protein, typically some meat, which most of us do, how does that process by the body? We're not seeing that immediate glucose spike. How does the GI tract handle that? Because, if you say we could only absorb 30 grams, then all of us would be dead, be skinny as can be because we'd have no food, right?
Right. It's actually a lot slower than people think. I mean, if you look at the radio labeled studies, some of these the carbons from some of these aminos are, if you eat a steak, are still in your bloodstream, up to 20, 24 hours later. So the digestive process is really slow. especially if you eat a large quantity. It takes forever to be digested. You know, it has to go all, you know, distal small intestine. It takes hours to get there. It takes hours to be digested, and it's still in your bloodstream hours after that. And so I think it's a lot slower than people think when you're eating real food. And you're right, a lot of these, you know, 20 to 30 grams 4 times a day is just trying to game the muscle protein synthesis studies using whey protein and looking at leucine. And there's a lot of artificiality in the research there is mostly, you know, whey protein in vivo, a lot of it are in vitro, and a lot of it's not. I don't think it really applies to just sitting down and eating a steak. So I don't know.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Ted, hey, there's a question about women versus men. Do women need to eat more fat than men, more dietary fat than men?
Well, I don't think there's a difference in men and women in terms of how much dietary fat that they should be eating. I think that women are a little more sensitive to low energy states. They'll see a bigger, you know, hormonal change in low energy states. So I definitely like smaller deficits for women who are trying to lose weight. You know what I mean? You might want to only be a few hundred calories below your, um, you never, if you're a woman, you really never want to go below your basal metabolic rate in terms of calories. So I really hate it when women go on these ultra low calorie diets because I think they're more greatly affected than men. So I guess in that regard, yeah, they might want to eat more fat. They don't want to do as aggressive a caloric deficit, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was reading there was a study out there looking at the satiety effects of CCK and showing that women, for whatever reason, are less sensitive to the satiety effects of CCK than adult men are and children. And so maybe there's some reason they need to eat a little bit more to get the same level of satiety because they're supposed to eat more, perhaps. Who knows? Kind of an interesting thought there. But what else, Ted? We've taken an hour. It's flown by. Is there anything else we need to know that you want to relay? Where can people find out about your book? Where can people find you? What are your plans for the post coronavirus life?
Oh man, well, coronavirus, the biggest tragedy for me is that this ultimate frisbee game I play all the time, it has been dead for the coronavirus epidemic. So I'm just dying to go out and play some ultimate. That's my big plan. I wrote this book called The PE Diet. PE is protein to energy. And you can check the book out at thepediet.com. I'm online on all those social media stuff, most active on Twitter at Ted Naiman. Yeah, no other major big plans, just ready to go back outside.
Has Washington announced a reopen plan yet? Do they have I know there's some kind of Western states pact, and I know California just said they may be keeping things shut down to June 1st or something, which I think it's just disheartening. I don't know.
Right. They haven't really said. So I don't believe the governor has announced exactly when we're going to be able to get back out there. But yeah, obviously, I hope it's soon, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, hopefully this thing will settle it down and we can get back to life. I know they're talking about, shutting down, the food system's collapsing and all that crazy stuff. So a little concerning. So anyway, well, Ted, thanks so much. You guys can pick up the PE Diet book if you can. I've got a copy. It's wonderful. It'll help you, put into context some of this stuff. I do think, you can be on a carnivore diet and lose weight, but you can still overeat. It's still doable. And I think you just have to realize that. So anyway, thanks everybody. Thank you, Ted. I'm going to shut this one
Oh, thanks for
down.
having me.
Yeah, no problem. It was wonderful. And hopefully, like I said, we'll get out of this stuff soon and life will go back to relative normalcy. Or hopefully it'll be a catalyst to change people. I mean, we have all these metabolically sick people, and maybe we'll actually visit that topic and maybe try to do something to change the system. I'm a little
That would be
pessimistic.
good.
I think people will go back to what they're normally doing, but
Probably.
never know. All right, guys, take care. We'll see everybody tomorrow. Bye, everybody.
All right,
See you
man.
guys.
Peace.